joining us this morning. I hope you've had a productive and profitable evening, and it's good to see so many faces at this hour. We are, as is the way of things with the World Economic Forum, of course, already running 10 minutes behind schedule, so we'll do our best to keep on track here if we can, and if we can make up some time, that'll be great, although as I think we're all aware, the topic at hand is the future of the planet, so it would be nice if we could give it at least 45 minutes or so. My name is Jeff Cutmore. You'll find me normally on CNBC Europe, where I'm the presenter of the Squawk Box program. It's very kind of the World Economic Forum to invite me along to this event, and I'm very pleased to be here given the significance of the issue at hand this morning. Now, of course, the title of the panel, Powering the New Champions, How Green Can $20 Trillion Be, is taken from the IEA's report of last year, the World Energy Outlook. I think Claude Mandel is always good for a colourful quote, and as the report was released, Claude said, "The energy future we are facing is dirty, insecure, and expensive." I talk to business leaders every day on CNBC, and I look at the surveys of the issues that business leaders flag up, CEOs, management committees, boards. Emerging markets comes pretty high on the list, but generally the number one topic of concern is climate change and how I, as a company, engage with the issue. And to be quite frank, and with the greatest respect to some of those on our panel here who are involved in policy creation, the message I consistently get is we are all at sea on the framework that we should be pursuing. We are not clear on the technology that is going to lead us out of our energy crisis and our demand for a cleaner environment. We are not clear on the global, national and local policies that are being laid out, and we are not clear on the legal framework that we are meant to pursue. And let's face it, if you are in a long-tail business, which may take some 20 to 30 years to recoup significant investment, boy, you better hope you have some clarity on some of these issues. Since this session was drafted, events have overtaken us, of course, and it's been of great interest to me to hear the comments from the Premier here and President Hu down at the APEC session in Australia. If you missed the squabbling that took place down in Australia, then I ask you to indulge yourself in some of the commentary because it has made fine reading. Hu has avowed support for the differentiated model as laid out in Kyoto and the UN framework, and has really, I think, put President Bush and Prime Minister Howard somewhat on the back foot, with America and Australia both now non-signatories of Kyoto. You may not like Kyoto, but let's face it, folks, it is at this stage the only thing we have to work with, as well as the UN framework. But we can get into these issues. I think that's enough from me. I think it's important now that I introduce you to our panel and we can tackle some of the issues at heart in this question. If I can run along the panel, maybe starting closest to me. Jiang Xiaoqiang is Vice Chairman of the National Development and Reform Commission for the People's Republic of China. Ralph Peterson is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of CH2M Hill Companies. Effectively, you are in the environmental engineering game, Ralph, if I can say that. Connie Hedegaard is Minister for the Environment of Denmark and Minister for Nordic Cooperation. Nice to have you with us. Lars Josefsson, President and Chief Executive Officer of Vattenfall Sweden, one of the major power companies in continental Europe. And last but no means least, since you are the furthest away from me, you're introduced last, Eileen Clausen, President of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, with us from the United States. And Eileen, I think if I can start with you, even though I introduced you last, and Minister, if you'll forgive me, but I think it would be interesting to take an American perspective, albeit I'm not asking you, Eileen, to represent the views of the United States, but coming from APEC, it seems to me that we are now in a situation where the Chinese are running ahead of the United States in terms of the policy agenda for achieving climate gas reduction targets that the world can live with. Eileen.
I'm not exactly sure I would put it that way. The reality is that all the major economies, and we could look at maybe 20 countries, have to be a part of the policy leadership. China has to be a part of it, and of course the United States, which is having a very hard time figuring out exactly what it ought to do, and there is a great difference of view within the United States on what should be done, has to be a part of it, and of course Europe has to be a part of it, and India, all the big economies. But I think it's important to understand that if you look at the 20 largest economies, they vary by a factor of 17 in terms of per capita income, and 14 in terms of per capita greenhouse gas emissions, which leads me to my real point about Kyoto and beyond. We need a much more flexible framework, a framework that can encompass countries that are very, very different, in different states of development. All of them have to be a part of this, but they do not all have to do the same thing in the same way.
Thank you very much. Minister Hedegaard, if I could ask you to come in. Denmark, of course, very significantly involved in pushing along the UN framework. The meeting in Australia was meant to provide a framework for the next session in Bali. I wonder how that takes us forward now from here. I welcome your comments on the policy agenda.
Well, basically, I think that things are moving in the right direction. And I also think that although I have been one of those criticizing the US for not moving ahead far enough, I think that things are moving. And as I see it, US is key. Because when we want to have this to end up in an international agreement in 2009 in Copenhagen, to have the international framework set up for after 2012, I think that it is quite impossible to imagine how we can make countries like China, India, and others to move their position if not the US is moving her position. Then I think it is positive that actually things are happening, and I am looking forward very much to what will happen in New York on the 24th of September. And I think that's very important for all here, also for the messages that you convey to your governments, that when the UN General Secretary, Ban Ki-moon, has asked for a special session on climate change in New York on the 24th of September, I think that the signals that the world community will send from New York to Bali, where we will have to make a framework that should lead to the new international agreement in 2012. I think that would be very, very crucial what the Chinese government, the Indian government, the US government will come up with on the 24th of September this month in New York. So we're looking forward very much to that.
It seems to me there is a excuse me, there is a fundamental issue at the heart of this debate, and that is, should developing nations bear the same burden to cut emissions as developed ones? What would be the European position on that debate?
Our position in EU will be that not the same burden, but some burden, because we cannot alone solve this problem. EU has 14% of world's emission. That is sort of our contribution. And we have set up a goal that we would reduce CO2 emissions in 20 by 20%, or if we get an international agreement with 30%. That does not necessarily mean that everybody else will have to come up with the same percentages. But I think it's very difficult to see how we can reach the target needed, environmentally speaking, if not the developing countries and the more well-off of the developing countries are contributing somehow. So that is why I think that there is a lot of things that will have to be changed compared to the Kyoto Protocol. But the language about common but differentiated responsibilities, I think that is still a way of thinking that could help us all solve the problem, as scientists tells us that we'll have to do.
Thank you. While we wait for the policy framework to be worked out, inevitably we all need to move forward with our lives and adopt technologies that we think might actually achieve something on the ground. And Lars Josefsson, if I could bring you in at this point, because one of the other issues at the heart of this debate is energy intensity, just how much energy is consumed to produce 1 unit of GDP. And we know that China uses significantly more energy than some of the more advanced countries technology-wise around the world. Lars, if I can bring you in, how critical is it that we make progress in this area, and how can we make progress if we are going to increase the green quotient in that 20 trillion that the IEA expects to be spent over the next 25 to 30 years?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to say that business community, I think, is key here, and the business community is already globalized, maybe ahead of politics. So to me it's a question of mobilizing the business community in order to make the millions of decisions that are needed in order to save the planet. And in that there is some hope, and I'd like to just point out that through an initiative which we call the 3C, we have accumulated some 50 odd global businesses ranging from China, India, Japan, United States, Europe, South Africa, and so on, committed to draw a roadmap how to do this. We have also made a map which we call the climate abatement map, and this is encompassing all the possible measures how to reach the abatement of greenhouse gases, all of what we know. And in there we have, of course, energy efficiency, which is the other side of energy intensity. And the interesting thing is that a quarter of what we need to do until 2030 is actually profitable. So that can be done today. But what business has here, I would say, is the know-how. I think role is politics know what, and business probably know how. So business decisions are indispensable here. And there are a lot of things that are profitable. Some actually needs new policies in order to be released. And I think this is the ground for a very fruitful cooperation between business and politics. And I can sense that business is there, ready to be a partner for politics to take the decisions that are ready and necessary to save this planet.
Thank you. Ralph, if I can bring you in at this point, and maybe it's useful, I think, to talk a little bit about best of breed practice currently, and maybe we can share with our friends here in China what is happening in terms of leading edge technology now to achieve some of these goals.
Yeah, the world I live in is a fairly practical world where we design and build and engineer factories and manufacturing and power plants. And I would preface my remarks by observing that about a third of the world's total energy consumption goes into these industrial processes and the manufacturing plants and facilities that make the building materials like steel and aluminum and cement, and the refineries that make our fuels and appliances and light bulbs and air conditioners and consumer products and food. And the remaining two-thirds of the energy, of course, is consumed by those of us who actually use those products, the automobiles and the light bulbs and the air conditioners. So the energy efficiency of the products that come out of this industrial infrastructure that Lars spoke about is an important part of the equation. But let me zero in, if I may, on the manufacturing and process plants, because a lot of that is the activity that's actually going on here in Asia and is the stewardship responsibility of these new champions that we're addressing. These plants and facilities represent a massive stock of capital, Jeff. As you mentioned, these facilities that once built are around for decades, and so decisions taken now are quite important. And it is helpful to think separately about what can be done to improve the energy efficiency and stewardship of those existing plants and facilities versus those newly constructed plants and facilities that have, frankly, a much better opportunity for cost-effective application of new process and manufacturing. Because the real breakthroughs that are needed are going to come best in these new facilities, because retrofitting the existing plants and existing capital works with that are equipped with older technology is frankly a lot more difficult. That said, as Lars has mentioned, there are many opportunities to improve the energy efficiency of those existing facilities. I would opine, as he intimated, that something in the order of 20% of a reduction in energy consumption can be achieved, particularly if the pricing signals can be made right. And let me touch on that in just a moment. But the key concept to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, this energy efficiency in these industrial and manufacturing plants is an economic decision. An economic decision reflects cost and it reflects risk. And generally speaking, buying energy efficiency involves trading off capital cost or upfront investment against longer-term operating cost. And in
Ralph,
the case,
I'm going to have to hurry you along, unfortunately.
Yeah, in the case of these new technologies, there's also a risk aspect that has to be reflected. And the key point is that the capital markets tend to be very short-term focused and very risk-averse. And so there is an aversion to trying these new risky breakthrough technologies because of uncertainty and performance. So if I could be granted one wish, it would be that wish to secure an energy efficient and sustainable energy future. It would be to have dependable long-term energy pricing signals to the marketplace. Pricing that reflects the true cost of energy, including those currently unpriced externalities like carbon emissions, because those pricing signals are the principal means to harness the marketplace, the economics-driven marketplace, to fuel the innovation, the kind of capital investments.
Ralph,
and there is sign
I've really
of
got to
hope.
cut you off at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that anyway. Sorry to have to draw you to a close, but I think we're all very intrigued to take the Chinese perspective on this, and it's with some deliberation that I've left you until last, sir. If I can ask the Vice Chairman to perhaps shed more insight on China's approach to achieving control on climate gases and moving us forward globally.
Okay. In fact, as my friend mentioned just now, the climate change issues is quite closely related to the energy saving and development. For China, it's a country with 1.3 billion population, only $2,000 per capita, and we are in the processing of the accelerated industrialization and urbanization. It's quite true the energy demand will increase in the future. But in the meantime, we also pay great attention for the energy saving and the environment protection. So we are trying to, in one hand, to have a method to establish a stable, clean, and safe energy supply system. That means we need to develop the energy industry. But in another hand, we also need to make every necessary measure to ensure this should be a clean energy used for the development, such like the clean coal technology, use the large-scale, high energy efficiency, low coal consumption, and low pollution thermal power plant, and of course, to accelerate the development of renewable energy. Just 3 years ago, the Chinese government published our long-term renewable energy development program. According to that program, by year 2020, the share of the renewable energy for China's total will increase from last year's 7% to 15%. That means we need at least invest about 200 billion euros for this renewable energy development. And of course, we also set up two important targets. In one hand, reduce the per unit GDP energy consumption 20% reduction by year 2010 compared with year 2005, and 10% reduction of the main pollutions by the year 2010. Of course, according to our policy and different kind of the measures, we already saw some kind of the development. For example, in the last year, the per unit energy consumption had been reduced 1.3%, which is the first time since 2003. And in the first half of this year, the per unit energy consumption has been reduced nearly 3%. You can compare the figure last year and the first half of this year. And we are also willing to strengthen the cooperation between the government, the enterprises, and the whole society of the country, to mobilize the whole country in one hand to still develop our energy sector to meet the demand need, but in another hand to strengthen the energy saving and environmental protection activities. And in fact, the Chinese government in different levels already, enlarged input for the energy saving and environmental protection. The Chinese enterprises and financial institutions also do the same thing. And we also want to strengthen the cooperation with international society, both for the energy development, energy saving, environmental protection, to actively handle the climate changes, which can make sure the sustainable development, not only for China, but for the whole human set.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask the first question, then I'd like to open it to the floor, because I like to take as much input as I can from you this morning. But my observation would be there is a perception that the policy from the central government is perhaps right for China's circumstances, but that the implementation, when it comes down through provincial government and to individual businesses, is somewhat different from the policy framework that the central government lays out. And I myself have had experience reporting on stories where provincial governors have told me that we have not put in energy-saving glass, energy-efficient technology because it is just too expensive.
Yes, you're right. Just like my friend mentioned that, when we promote the energy saving and use clean technology, we must try to set up a relatively favorable legal and policy framework which can provide incentives for the end users to use this kind of the energy saving and clean technology. In the national level, we already have the very clear overall picture and target. We are trying to establish the overall incentive systems, but still there needs some time. So currently, I think that both the local government and the Chinese enterprises already pay a lot of attention about these kind of issues. But as everyone understands, the enterprises themselves have their own target, the profitability, the development of their business. So that means the government needs to use more efficient measures to encourage the enterprises, such like the tariff, such like the incentives to promote the renewable energy development. Maybe in the early stage, the cost is very high. If you can give some the incentive, such like high tariff or relatively low tax burden, the enterprises will have been mobilized to develop this kind of the business.
Thank you very much. Could you put your hand up and let me know if you would like to ask a question at this point? We will have a microphone brought to you. Of course, I'd like you to tell me your name, and I'd also like me to tell you who you would like to take the question if it is intended for a specific panelist. Sir, let's bring the microphone to you down at the front.
Good morning. My name is Will Nixon, and I would like to ask the Minister...
And where are you from, Will?
I'm from the United States.
And could you give us a company or an industry?
Yes, I'm from the investment management industry in the United States.
Thank you.
And this is a general question for the entire panel, and that is, first of all, Minister, I appreciate you describing the necessity for a balance of fuel efficiency, cleaner fuels, with the needs of people to have jobs and to progress. But the main question is, listening to you, what are the new clean sources? I haven't heard anyone talk about the future in terms of how, is it coal? Is it nuclear? Is it gas? I don't believe that it is going to be some of the things like ethanol in the United States, which take more energy to produce than they actually give out. So would you talk about that?
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for the question.
For China, hydropower will be a sector which we still think there have a great potential. Currently, we already have largest power capacity for the hydropower, but still there have at least 2/3 of this potential have yet be developed. And of course, we treat the bioenergy as a very, good business for the clean but renewable energy. Of course, we think the nuclear power is one of the clean technology and clean energy. But just like you mentioned that still for China, not for other countries maybe, coal is a main energy. So the top priority for China is how to develop the clean coal technology and applicate it in a large scale.
Thank you. Minister.
It's just to your question, because I think you cannot say it's one thing. It will be something of everything almost. So it will be some clean coal, it will be some gas, it will be renewables, it will be a whole range of things, and maybe it will also be fuel cells and other things in a not too distant future. Some would argue renewables cannot do the trick. And here I may offer the Danish example, because for 25 years we had 70% growth without increasing our total energy consumption. And one of the things that we achieved were much more energy efficiency, but also today renewables, primarily biomass and wind, will account for 28% of our electricity. So I think that we should not rule out the possibility of focusing much more on renewables.
Eileen.
Yes, I'd like to reiterate that point. It's a portfolio of technologies. There is no silver bullet. There's no single technology. But I'd like to just say something about coal, because I think that is the most important issue that we deal with if we're going to address climate change. The United States has a lot of coal. It's cheap. It's available. China has a lot of coal. It's cheap. It's available. I think the reality is we are going to burn a lot of coal. The imperative is to find a way to capture the emissions and store them so that they do not affect the climate. And we are not that close to being able to do that from a technological perspective. And that's why we need both a policy and some very serious large-scale demonstrations to show that this can be done and that all future coal-burning power plants will capture and store the emission stream.
Lars.
Just like to add there, to direct answer to the question, there are 3 sources of energy which is in abundant supply. One is renewables, second one is nuclear, and the third one is clean coal. and clean coal has to be there, echo what Eileen says, but I have a more optimistic view on the commercial availability. Our company is right now building a pilot plant that will go in operation next year based on the so-called oxy-fuel technology, which according to me is the most promising technology. And the European Union has a plan to have 12 large-scale plants in operation by 2015, a plan which we are supporting. So I think this is clearly the way ahead. But, of course, the clean coal will be more expensive than the dirty coal, if you like, which means, and that's a major point, I think there has to be a price on carbon in the future. Otherwise, we will not be able to save the planet.
Ralph.
Yeah, I think the key, as the other panelists have said, is the portfolio, the multi-phase approach, because that is also a means to secure, to build a more secure and stable pricing environment for an energy future, which eliminates some of the uncertainty. And for my bet, looking at all these technologies from an engineering perspective, I mean, I think coal and clean coal is at the top of the list, followed by nuclear. And the only thing that eclipses those two as alternative sources, because the coal is capable of producing liquid fuels in the fullness of time through known technology, it's just kind of expensive, would be that of energy efficiency and process modification. So I'm bullish on coal, IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle in particular, and bullish on nuclear.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman right at the back over here, if we can get a microphone to him. I saw his hand go up first. Let's try and keep the questions nice and punchy, and then I can get in as many as possible. Sir.
Jack Hittery from the Hittery Foundation, New York. I'll be as punchy as possible. The previous question really focused on a range of energy sources focused on generating electricity. I'd like to focus my question on transportation, another huge user of energy. Mainly, obviously, transportation today uses oil. In America, we have 230 million cars. Europe has even more. Europe has chosen a pathway of small cars and diesel cars mainly to extract more mileage per gallon using diesel rather than refined gasoline. China today has tens of millions of cars, and soon will have an equal number of cars to the US and Europe. What are the thoughts of the panel in terms of the different pathways towards getting off dependence on oil, particularly in terms of emissions, as well as moving towards electrification of transportation via hybridization and via full electrification? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Vice Minister, let's start with you.
You know, we think that for China, the transportation sector is also an important sector which have a great potential for the energy saving. And compared with the different kind of the types of transportation, we think that we should give the priority to the railway system, because this system, compared with the airplane with the expressway, the cars, is most energy saving funds for meet the transportation development.
That's a nice idea, but it doesn't work. People want cars, they like their space. You can't stop people buying cars once they've got the money for them.
But, you know, there have two different kind of the demand within the city. You know, most people want to have the cars. Intercity travel, you cannot, you know, mainly by car. Of course, I know in the United States, many of the people enjoy the long way driving of the car, even over the American land. But for many of the countries, you know, for the long-term traveling, particularly for the cargo transportation, you should still mainly rely on the railway system. That is a system we give the priority. In the urban sector, in my hand, I think that if the people with the increase of their personal income, they want to have much more, you know, specified, very, you know, simple, but also very, you know, easy transportation vehicles. That means private car. But in another hand, we need also try to develop the public transportation system, such as the metro system and the public bus system. Give the citizens have the more choices which may have reduced some of this kind of the burden for the private car.
Sure. I mean, we tried joined up transport systems in America and in Europe, but the question was about the car, and I wonder if I could just force you to address that question, because Shanghai is building roads like it's going out of fashion, and the only way I see them trying to control traffic is by using this alternate number plate system ahead of the Olympics, and trying to encourage people perhaps not to buy. But everybody wants to own a car. Once they've got enough money, it's a status symbol. If I want to show I've made it today in China, I need to own a big car.
So for the car itself, you may have mentioned that the government shouldn't, just simply to, block the demand of the citizens. But on the other hand, we are set up the policy framework to encourage people to use the more energy efficiency cars. We use a different tax rates, and I think this is just the early stage. In the future, we will try to develop much more, effective of the policy framework to promote the people, to incent the people use this energy-saving cars.
So a carrot and stick approach, really. Anybody else like to comment on this?
Yes, Jack Hillary was asking also about the different paths that we have chosen in Europe compared to the US. And one of the things that we have been doing in the European Union is to set up political regulation, not to be afraid of increasing standards for vehicles, for instance, for what is allowed when it comes to CO2 emissions and so on and so forth. And also taxation isn't that big issue. I mean, we have taxation on gasoline. In Denmark, we have heavily taxation on cars. Some would argue much too much taxation. But still, it's a way of trying to steer demand patterns so that actually we can make people demand cars that run longer on a mileage than shorter on a mileage.
Yep.
I mean, let me just say briefly that for the first time in more than a decade, I actually think the United States Congress is going to enact legislation that would set standards for fuel efficiency for vehicles that are actually relatively ambitious. So I think we're coming back to that. The other issue is, and it was raised by the questioner, is the issue of the fuels. And I think it is interesting that California now has a low carbon fuel standard. And I think that may be a model for how we look at fuels in the way forward.
All right, Lars?
Yeah, I just like to be a bit controversial maybe and say that fuel standards is not enough. I think we have to move to the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, which will be the road to the bridge to the all-electric vehicle. Technology is just around the corner. I would suggest that policymakers should actually give a push in that direction, because that's the way to go. Already today you can build a car where you can do 100 kilometers on electricity only. So I think this is the way to go. We shouldn't be stopped by saying a conservative industry here.
Ralph?
Yeah, I think the key is, in my mind, a combination of making the fuel cost and pricing more a demand driver, and Europe has done that through taxation, and that's probably a good thing. And if you couple that then with the regulatory authority, as Eileen said, on corporate average fuel efficiency standards, those regulatory standards become more palatable when the consumer can see an advantage because the cost of petrol is more expensive. That combination then will drive the innovation that Lars talked about.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm on a very tight time deadline, and I realize that many of you have other sessions to go to. We started late, and I'm sorry. We've tried to save the world in a little under 45 minutes, but we'll have better luck next time. Can I just thank my panelists for being with us and giving us such a spirited performance? Thank you very much.